Hello and welcome to my key setup video for IL-2 Great Battles. In this video I will talk about how to set up your basic keys to control aircraft in the game. It's impossible to mention everything. However, I think you will get a clear idea where to find all the controls to approach binding keys. I had to split this video in two parts. One part to assign the basics, and in the next I will talk about the assignments for the manual engine controls. Otherwise the entire thing would have been way too long. Important to understand is that you don't need all the keys to fly certain aircraft. For example, if you just fly a Bf-109, you can skip almost the entire engine control section, and, for example, all the controls for roll and yaw trim are meaningless because a 109 does not have the option to trim those surfaces. At the same time, this opens up the possibility for double bindings. For example, an aircraft which features water radiators does not have the outlet shutter of the air-cooled radial engine. It makes sense to bind them on the same button. Therefore, if you are now a beginner, setting up keys for a flight sim is quite difficult when you don't know how the aircraft work in detail. Even when the game would explain it to you, an absolute beginner would still struggle to grasp the concept. But I try, and let me show you step by step. The first thing I can recommend is to clear all the joystick binds from the camera and pilot head control section of the game. All those joy number bindings. This is very confusing. If you need camera assignments to your stick, you can later assign the action you want to the keys you want. By removing those key binds, you avoid confusing double binds when you now set up other functions. But that out of the way, we can start. You will find the key bind in the game under the menu Settings and then Key Mapping. The game has split the key mapping menu in different sections. Let us take a quick look at the service section. You can find some basic key binds. Important is the lobby key, which is the scoreboard and multiplayer, and the briefing button. The briefing button brings up the map in expert multiplayer servers. Note that the map key showed here is the map you get in non-expert servers and is useless on expert servers. So I removed the map bind completely and set up M as my briefing button, which brings up the map in game. I know it's confusing, but that's how it is. I use the spacebar as my briefing map key when I'm flying in VR, so I can find the map button blindly when I have my VR goggles on. Two more bindings are interesting here, and that is the assignment to hide the HUD and to hide the instrument panel. H and I. The rest of the buttons are less important or self-explanatory. I will skip the camera section for now. The camera section mainly contains the controls for the third-person camera and is not important when you fly the aircraft in first person like most of you should. If you want to control your camera zoom with buttons and not an axis, I recommend to assign the zoom in and zoom out functionality. This way you can adjust the zoom speed with the field of view change speed slider and the inertial slider in the camera setting page of the game. However, if you want to use a physical axis to control your zoom speed, use the head zoom assignment instead. This way the zoom speed is determined by how quickly you move the physical axis. If you are playing with a VR headset, you can assign the quick zoom keys in this menu here. In VR it's sometimes important to reset your head position in the cockpit, so you are back in the center, and the default VR view assignment does that for you. Another useful assignment is Save Current Corrections in Head Snap Position. This allows you to save the current head position as the new default. Good to get a more comfortable default head position in your cockpit. I will link a video of Requiem, who did a great video on the topic going into more detail, which is outside of the scope of this video. If you're planning to play the game in expert mode, you can totally ignore most of the AI autopilot assignments in the beginning of this section. Only the autopilot for level flight works in expert mode. By pressing Shift and A, this will keep your aircraft level, at least if the plane is already pretty much in level flight. The rest of the AI options work only when playing on normal difficulty servers or in single player. But now for the main controls of the aircraft. And the first one is the pitch axis. The aircraft pitch axis is controlled via the aircraft's elevator. This, of course, has to be on the flight stick. Pushing the flight stick to push the nose of the aircraft down and pulling the stick to pull the nose up. When you assign this axis in IL-2, a small graph appears in the right corner of this row. If you click on it, you can check if the controls are working. If you like, you can also set a dead zone in the center or on the edges of the axis movement range. For example, to compensate for a worn-out joystick. You can also adjust the translation curve of the axis, called sensitivity in the game. This is the translation from physical flight stick to digital flight stick in the cockpit. By default, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. I would recommend keeping the sensitivity where it is if possible. With a good joystick, this should be doable and has advantages. One being that building muscle memory is much easier when the actual movement of the physical stick also means that the digital axis moves by the same amount. I personally have all my axes unchanged at a 1-to-1 ratio, but there are of course cases where a non-linear curve makes sense, especially with smaller joysticks where you want to have less movement around the center of the axis. The roll axis and the yaw axis can be set up similarly. The roll axis of course on the left-right throw of the joystick, and the yaw axis is mostly assigned to either the twist of the joystick if you have no rudder pedals, or of course you can assign it to your pedals. The next bit of the key assignments are all dedicated to the trim and stabilizer assignments. Trim or stabilizer is needed to allow for hands-free flying or to make certain maneuvers easier or even possible. When an aircraft gets slower or faster or flies higher or lower, the resulting lift and drag forces on the aircraft change to different extents, meaning that the aircraft starts to roll, pitch up or down or yaws in a direction. These movements are often unwanted and cause drag and in the end workload for the pilot, since he has to correct for those forces. And trim corrects exactly for that by moving either tiny parts on the control surfaces or even the entire control surface a tiny bit, stopping the unwanted movement. The most important trim control, and because you need it so often, is the elevator trim. Hence why it has to be accessible at any point in flight. I personally trim my plane up and down with the head switch of my joystick. When I pull my head switch back, the plane gets more tail heavy. If I push the head switch down, the aircraft becomes more nose heavy. On aircraft which move the entire control surface, you have to bind the stabilizer. For aircraft with tiny trim tabs, you have to assign the trim assignments. For some aircraft, you have to bind the switch assignment, like for the Focke-Wulf 190s, which move their stabilizer by pressing a button, or you have to assign an axis, for example for the Bf 109, which have that on an axis. But if you want, you can bind all the different trim technologies to the same button. I have it all on my head switch. This works because when you hit a button on an axis assignment, the assignment can also be used with a button. Sounds super complicated, but as soon as you test it a bit more, it makes absolute sense. I think this is a great moment where I can explain the use of a modifier. So essentially a modifier allows you to create more keybind options without having more keys available to you. And also a modifier makes accidental triggers of certain bindings less likely. So in my bindings you see many assignments of my left shift button and left control button plus a certain button on my joystick. And this is basically what I do here. I use a modifier. It's easily set up. You just click on the assignment and you press the left control key while you're pressing your joystick key and the assignment is done. Only 3 selected buttons of the keyboard can be assigned as a modifier. For example, the left shift control, left alt, right alt control and right shift can be used as a modifier. And now it becomes more complicated, but bear with me. I know it might be confusing to you. I'm not actually pressing the left control key when I use my aileron trim, for example. I use a software which basically translates a joystick press to a key press on my keyboard, because the game can't handle joystick buttons as modifiers. So I use this tiny software called Xpadder. The two orange buttons on the back of my joysticks are acting like left shift and left control. I use those buttons in actuality when I'm flying. I'm pressing one of those orange buttons plus my head switch left and right to either control the yaw or the roll trim. Flaps are surfaces on the aircraft which can be deployed to increase lift and or drag of an aircraft. They allow an aircraft to be flown with less airspeed without falling out of the sky than normally. This helps in some takeoff situations, but mainly in landing situations. Flaps can also help in certain combat situations. On some aircraft they can be deployed gradually, so you press for a couple of seconds and they deploy a little bit. On other aircraft they deploy in stages, and in other aircraft they deploy fully right away when you press the button. And there are even more oddities around, like the MiG, which worked even differently. But in the end, there are only two buttons necessary: deploy and retract. I have the flap controls on the back of my throttle. Pushing this little knob down deploys the flaps, pulling it up retracts them, and this is all there is to it. You can of course bind it to an axis, for example, if you have an axis available to you. But this is how I do it. Next assignment is gear up and gear down. Kinda self-explanatory. I keep that bind on my keyboard so I can't hit that accidentally, and I don't bind up more options on my joystick. You can put it wherever you want. I still have it on G. Pressing G for gear up, pressing G again for gear down. Next important assignment is the tailwheel lock. Not all aircraft have a controllable tailwheel lock, but for example the VF-09 can be difficult to taxi at times when the tailwheel is not unlocked. I have this on the base of my joystick, and also coupled with a modifier with one of the orange buttons. Wheel brakes are also important to taxi and, surprise surprise, to slow down the aircraft on the ground. Note that the wheel brake button needs to be used in planes where the left and right wheel brake can't be used independently, like most Allied aircraft, for example the Yachts or the British aircraft Tempest and Spitfire. In contrast, you should use the left and right wheel brakes for aircraft which have toe brake features, like the Bf-109 and many other German aircraft. I personally trigger the general wheel brake by pressing down the little joystick on the back of my throttle. I use that as a button. I use my rudder pedals for the toe brakes. They have a toe brake feature like the rear pedals in the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulfs. Canopy open and close. When you spawn in an aircraft in a quick battle or in multiplayer, you have to close the cockpit. But in some aircraft it can be useful to open the cockpit mid-flight. So I put it on the base of my joystick next to my tailwheel unlock with a modifier to avoid an accidental trigger. Bindings which I often need in quick succession are often close to each other. You noticed that the canopy open and close button is right next to my tailwheel lock. This is because I need that very often in quick succession. For example, when I get ready in my aircraft, I want to take off, I close my cockpit and then I lock my tailwheel, for example. Next assignment, sadly also very important, a button you wish you never need to press, but if you need to press it, you want to be able to be activated as quickly as possible, and that is of course the bailout. To trigger it, I press both of my modifiers on the back of my throttle and the big red button on the back of my joystick. I have to lean over a little bit, but you really want to assign it to a button you can press quickly but never accidentally. Note that bailing out requires more than just hitting a button in the game. World War II aircraft had no ejection seat, so you have to slow down or use other techniques like a negative G-bund to eject yourself out of the cockpit. You need 2 more assignments to be able to take off and to fly around in your aircraft if you just freshly installed IL-2. And that is to start the engine sequence when you're standing on the ground cold, and the throttle. For that, switch into the engine control section of the key setup menu and go to Start Engine Sequence. Assign it to a button you can't press accidentally, and but at the same time you can press comfortably while, for example, when you are in VR, so you can hit it blindly. I personally still have it set up to right shift and E for engine. It's a bit hard to hit when in VR, but other than that it works perfectly well. It doesn't need to be on the joystick, you don't need it that often. The other assignment is of course the throttle, so you can control the amount of air which gets to the engine and in turn how much power the engine develops. And this is pretty self-explanatory. You just open up the assignment, and if you have, use your throttle device, your hardware for that. If you have a little axis on the joystick, that makes sense too. Other than that, this of course can be also bound to a button. And there you go, you just assigned all the basics you need to be able to take off in an aircraft, to fly around in an aircraft. You don't have yet assigned the manual engine controls, and that is what we're going to do in the next video. If you need to assign camera controls like on buttons, I can recommend the linked video of Requiem. He described the different camera settings quite well. I don't need to do this again, so take a look and watch his video. If you want to start blasting around and shooting your guns or dropping a bomb or a rocket, take a look in the weapons control section. The assignments are not really that difficult. I will go into details in the next part. However, you can assign, for example, to shoot all guns on your main trigger of the joystick, and assign a button for the bomb and rockets. It's really not that difficult. Other than that, I wish you a nice day and see you in the next one.